Misunderstand that and take it as an opening position and then start framing things and acting on that assumption, and you're off down a bad path. So it's not, I don't think, useful to answer the question in the abstract. It really is specific to who you're dealing with.
Your own preparation, setting aside all of the work that you do in reviewing briefs, etc. Sort of a two-part question, if I may. One is, do you ever have a plan for resolution before the mediation begins? And two, do you pick sides? How do you avoid coming to a mediation with a bias?
Having any plan as a mediator going into a mediation is certainly detrimental and usually fatal to getting it resolved. As soon as you have a plan, your mind starts closing, your ears start closing, you start limiting yourself, and that's just cannot be good. So what you have is a tension. We've been trained from law school on to be analyzing things and deciding, what's right and what's wrong and how this fits in with this, and thoughts come in. You can't stop thoughts from coming in. You try to, you're just putting more energy into the thoughts you're trying to stop coming in. You let them come in, you just don't be attached to them. You just keep letting them go. It's like a helium balloon. You just keep releasing it and releasing and releasing it. So what I've really schooled myself to do is to come in with no preconceived idea about what's right, what's wrong, what direction it could go in, and then let it evolve during the course, hopefully rapidly, but let it evolve during the course of the mediation. With regard to choosing sides, the perfect mediator, at least in mediation theory, has no preferences, has no judgments, has no, in effect, values that they're in any way going to impose on the process or even allow to infiltrate into the process. I'm an imperfect mediator. I don't know how to do that. And if I lie to myself and tell myself that I am perfect that way and I am doing that, I'm kidding myself, and I'm going to miss how my values may be impacting the process. So instead, I simply accept that it is true, that I do have values, that they're going to affect the process. I let myself feel either, affinity for or repulsion for someone's logic, someone's position, someone's breath, anything else. And then again, I just try to let it go. So inevitably, you're going to find that as a human being, you're pulled or pushed, one way or another. And the best thing you can do for the process is to just stay unattached to whatever the pulls are.
Let's go to the process, the mediation itself. I know it's your practice to insist in a respectful way that counsel make opening statements. Why?
Because too often there are assumptions about what the other side knows. Oh, surely they must have heard this. We've been fighting about this for years. And often those assumptions are simply not true. I have found that in cases that have been litigated, sometimes for years, involving immense amounts of money by skilled litigators with skilled business people, that the mediation joint session was the first time that a decision maker on one side or the other, or both, heard what the main point was that the other side was saying. Now, why that is so, we could have an interesting discussion about the degree to which that is a reflection of what happens in a fight where people just stop hearing what the other side is saying. But that it is so is sufficient for me. So one of the reasons for that presentation is to just make sure that each side has now really heard, this is where we're coming from, this is why we see it the way we do. And part of the joint session, at least the way I practice it, by summarizing back after you've had a presentation from one side, it's partly to make sure that I've got it straight. It's partly to reassure the party who's made the presentation that I've in fact heard it, but it's also to make sure that the other side has heard it, because while one side is making a presentation, the other side is thinking about how they're going to counterpunch on it, how little they like hearing with it. When the person they've hired to help them find their way through to a resolution is summarizing it back, they're listening intently. So part of the reason for the presentations, ironically, is so that the other side can hear in the mediator's summation back what it is you've been trying to say perhaps for years to them.
I'm glad you raised that. I was going to ask you about your practice, and for those of us that have not mediated with you, what happens when one mediates with Mr. Piazza is counsel gives an opening statement, and Tony takes voluminous notes as the opening statement is being made. And then, Tony, you give back the opening statement, sometimes much better and with greater clarity than the lawyer who gave it. And I always wondered whether in part you do that as well to help your preparation.
Well, what I'm doing when the presentation is being made is I'm scribbling furiously, trying to track it, because sometimes these presentations are going an hour and a half, 2 hours. Sometimes there's great technical detail, there's a lot of facts involved in it, and I really want to make sure that I'm getting it straight. When I summarize it back, again, my purpose is make sure I've got it straight. Reassure the person who made the presentation that I've actually been listening and, by implication, did my homework coming in, because otherwise I couldn't possibly have tracked that in that level of detail and got my brain around it in that short a time. And reflect to the other side, let them hear it in a summary, kind of an executive summary back to make sure they've got it. What I'm not trying to do in that summary back, and here is where practices vary, is start to put a spin on it, start to find common ground. If I've said X, having someone reflect it back to me in a way where they're starting to turn it, I want to hear that they've heard what I said. I'll be open at some point to hearing what they think about it, but at the moment I don't want them putting words in my mouth. So I noticed that some people have somehow learned in some kind of mediation training that what you're supposed to do is start trying to reframe issues, start trying to find common ground. There is a time and a place for that, but it's not in the joint session and it's not in the summation back.
Tony, if you could give us guidance in preparing openings, what would you tell us? What clues to be effective would you share with us?
It's a challenge, because what you want to do is strike a balance. If all you do is try to put the fear of the Lord in the other side of how thoroughly you're going to thrash them in court, you can expect that you're going to be getting their backs up. And you have to keep in mind, these are the people who you want to hear say yes at the end of the day to something that you're prepared to live with. And getting them in a no mode isn't probably the best way to start that out. At the same time, you do need to say clearly, well, look, we're not looking forward to this, but this is what we're going to do if we have to thrash this out at a trial. So there's a certain degree of diplomacy that's useful in it. Not a patronizing diplomacy, but just an honest, say, okay, we are going to want to hear from you, or we've already tried our best to hear from you how you see it. We're now going to try to tell you how we see it, not because we're necessarily sure we're right. This is how we see it. We want you to understand that. And if we're wrong, we'd like you to explain to us where we're wrong, because we fancy we're rational actors and we're prepared to assimilate data back. And conversely, we know and believe that you are rational actors, and we just want to put the data in front of you so that you can rationally evaluate it. Some version of that, I think, works best.
Every mediation we've done, when you introduce the mediation, you always give a warning. My words, not yours, but the essence is, don't fool the mediator. Why do you say that, and what do you mean?
When you go into caucus, there's a temptation to be negotiating with the mediator, and it's a rationally based temptation. There's the fear that if you're just utterly candid with the mediator early on in the process, a lot of bad things can happen. One is the mediator can just trot in the other room and tell the other side, what your bottom line is. And then they can take it as an opening point and try to drive you down from it. Or you may end up bidding against yourself with no resolution. Another fear is that the mediator might be a lazy sot, and if you're really candid with them about what you're willing to do and you don't try to set your sights and their sights higher, that you're never going to have a shot at anything better than what your absolute bottom line might be. So there are rational concerns about being candid with the mediator. I try to communicate to people that I don't engage in that kind of an iterative process where I'm bargaining with the parties, and therefore the risk is if they look me in the eye and they tell me, okay, look, this is it, that I'm going to take them literally, and there might have been a settlement that they could have had that they'll never even know about because they told me this was it and I believe them. So what I'm trying to communicate is there is a place for bargaining. You can tell the mediator, all right, this is our position, this is what you communicate to the other side, this is what we might really consider doing. You can bargain with the other side, you can bargain through the mediator with the other side, but that it's perilous to bargain with the mediator directly.
You mentioned going into caucus. Traditionally, you have a plenary session, and then you split the parties into separate rooms. I know you have a lot of purposes in your initial caucus. Talk about what you do and why you do it in that first meeting with each group of litigants.
There are a few things that the caucus is designed to accomplish. First, if there's confidential information that a party wants to share with the mediator, that's an opportunity to do it. There's a place for candor in the joint session, but there's also a place for discretion. And there are sometimes things that for strategic reasons, or you're just afraid that they're going to be inflammatory with the other side, you don't want to say across the table. So the first function of a caucus is to give an opportunity, to the extent you haven't already indulged in it in the briefing that you've given the mediator before the mediation, to make sure you've got all the information to the mediator that might be useful, whether it's about the other side, about your own position, about things that are intrinsic to or collateral to, but nonetheless relevant to getting a resolution. The second function of the caucus, at least as I practice, is to give the mediator an opportunity to give a candid evaluation to each side. If you try to do that in the joint session, you're going to inevitably get people's backs up. If you're turning to one side and saying, well, look, I think you've got a problem with how you're articulating the law on this in front of their opponents, it's going to just generate more friction and more resistance. So the caucus, the second purpose of it is to give the mediator an opportunity to just candidly say, look, this is how this presents to the outside. The third function of a caucus is to begin to candidly discuss what the realistic options might be for settlement without people fearing that they're bidding against themselves by articulating it across the table. So those are the three main functions of a caucus. What you do in the initial caucus, how you approach it, again, it's going to vary very much from mediator to mediator. A wise mediator, and too often I've been unwise in this regard, doesn't come in, talking, but comes into the caucus, at least the first caucus, very much listening, to make sure, and it's not a technique for gaining empathy or letting people know that you're really there for them. Or it's honestly just to make sure that you really aren't going off half-cocked without really getting a full understanding of what they think is important. Also, even though a litigator may be used to giving a concise delivery of information, the client may be not as accustomed to it, and they may need a little more time. They may have some emotional investment in it. So if you give the client an opportunity, as a mediator, if you give the client an opportunity in the first session to really make sure that they've been heard, that they've had a chance to say what they are feeling about this, it's very useful, and again, too often, at least on my part, forgotten, to take that time to be silent and really listen in the first caucus.
Tony, you mentioned case evaluation and getting feedback from both client and counsel, and that gives rise in my mind to what I think is a tough issue, both for lawyers and for mediators, and that's the issue of puffery, the issue of candor. What are the borders to being completely candid or stretching the truth, both for the lawyer and the client, and most of all, in your own mind, for the mediator?
Well, for the litigator, that's an interesting call. Your job is to be an advocate. Within the limitations of the ethical bounds, you're supposed to advocate as strongly as you can. So if you're asking me, is it okay, in my view, to be pushing a point perhaps a little more strongly than you think the law supports, to be arguing when on a factual issue, when that there are facts that would tend to undercut that argument, that's an individual call that every litigator has to make, and then stand before God someday and defend. And I wouldn't presume to pronounce on that. In terms of the mediator's position, it's an interesting question because your job is to get people to understand realistically what their risks are. When you walk into a situation where people are very charged up about their positions, If you simply dispassionately say, well, this is how it looks, but they've got beans in their ears, then they may not hear you. And so you might be tempted to say it a little more loudly just to make sure they've got it, not to overstate it, but just to make sure it's registered. Earlier in my career, I think I